Last time we uncovered this. Japan's founding myth has a contradiction built into its very first pages. When Emperor Jimmu entered Yamato, someone was already there. A figure who too had come from the heavens, who too carried the signs of divine authority. His name was Nigihayahi. The Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki do not erase him, they could not, but they moved past him quickly. Nigihayahi recognized Jimmu's legitimacy, took his side, and Yamato became Jimmu's. But one question remains. Why did that happen? What actually took place? How did a ruling line already established in Yamato yield its authority to a ruler who had only just arrived? The chronicles offer almost no answer. They record the outcome, and then fall silent at the center of it. Today, we go into that silence. One thing must be said clearly before we begin. There is no direct evidence that Nigihayahi was a historical person. Most scholars treat him first and foremost as a mythological figure, but in the clan traditions that claim him as an ancestor, in shrines, genealogies, and in the later texts known as the Sendai Kuji Hongi, there may be older memories that were never fully erased. This video does not treat those memories as established fact. But if there is a historical echo buried inside them, what does it reveal? That is the silence we enter today. The first thing to examine is how the chronicles handled Nigihayahi. Three patterns emerge. The first is genealogical ambiguity. In the Sendai Kuji Hongi, a later text, Nigihayahi is identified with Emi Wakari and described as the elder brother of Ninigi. In that account, he is a heavenly descendant who came down before Ninigi, arriving first by a different route. But the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki do not foreground that connection. They place Nigihayahi among the heavenly gods, yes, but they keep him at a careful distance from the direct imperial line through Ninigi. The political logic is clear. If Nigihayahi was Ninigi's elder brother, and if he reached Yamato first, then a dangerous question appears. Which line came first? Which line was original? That question had to be contained. The second pattern is temporal compression. The chronicles present the genealogy from Ninigi to Jimmu as relatively compact, and yet Nigihayahi appears already established in Yamato before Jimmu arrives. If he belonged to roughly the same broad generation as Ninigi, and had already built a ruling order in Yamato, then the time before Jimmu was longer and more layered than the chronicles allow. The chronicles dissolve that ambiguity into the age of the gods. Once something is placed inside mythic time, contradiction becomes harder to see. The third pattern is how the enemy is made. Nagasune Hiko, the man who resisted Jimmu to the end. The chronicles frame him as someone who simply could not accept Jimmu's divine legitimacy. Stubborn, blind, unable to read the signs. But consider what he may have been defending. Not merely a local chieftain's territory, but a different ruling line already present in Yamato. From within that logic, he was not a rebel. He was the final defender of a line that predated Jimmu. In history written by the victors, the enemy must be made unreasonable. Otherwise, the victor's legitimacy also comes into question. The chronicles managed all three, but there is a text that tells a different story. At this point, we need to turn to a single text, the Sendai Kuji Hongi. This document has long been viewed with suspicion. Its preface attributes authorship to Prince Shotoku and Soga no Umako, a claim that cannot be accepted at face value. From the Edo period onward, it was often dismissed outright as a forgery. But the story does not end there. Recent scholarship takes a more careful view. The preface may be fabricated, but the body of the text, particularly the Tenson Hongi in Volume 5 and the Kokuzu Hongi in Volume 10, is now thought to preserve genuine clan traditions of the Mononobe and Owari lineages. Recently, a fully annotated scholarly edition has been published, reflecting this reassessment. So where does that leave us? The Sendai Kuji Hongi cannot be accepted wholesale, but it cannot be discarded wholesale either. Within it may lie a parallel tradition, one the compilers of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki chose not to use, or could not use. And what that tradition says about Nigihayahi is significant. He is identified with Amino Hoakari and described as Ninigi's elder brother. He descends before Ninigi, carried on the Ameno Iwafune, the heavenly rock boat, and arrives in Yamato with 32 accompanying deities. He takes as his wife Tomiyabime, the sister of Nagasune Hiko. Their son is Umashimaji, and in the Sendai Kuji Hongi's account, by the time of Jimmu's eastern campaign, Nigihayahi is already dead. That detail shifts the entire picture. Nagasune Hiko was not defending a living ruler. He was defending a dynasty, one already in the process of ending. At this point, the story looks different. What Jimmu encountered in Yamato may not have been a rebellion at all. It may have been the last stand of an order that had been there first. So how did that order end? The figure at the center of the answer is Umashimaji, son of Nigihayahi, ancestor of the Mononobe clan. According to the Sendai Kuji Hongi, when Jimmu's forces closed in, Nagasune Hiko prepared to fight to the end. But Umashimaji made a different choice. He killed Nagasune Hiko himself and submitted to Jimmu. Was this betrayal, or was it something far more calculated? This does not have to be read as a simple defection. If there is a historical core to this tradition, Umashimaji understood that military victory was no longer possible, but he also understood something Jimmu did not yet possess: ritual legitimacy. The Sendai Kuji Hongi records that at the time of Jimmu's enthronement, Umashimaji presented the 10 sacred treasures, the Tokusa no Kandakara, and performed the rite of Chinkon, the pacification of the ruler's soul. A new king is about to be enthroned. Standing beside him is the son of the previous ruling line. In his hands are the sacred objects that belonged to his father's dynasty. And with those objects, he performs the rite that stabilizes the new ruler's reign. If this account carries weight, what is happening here is not simply conquest. It is the old order conferring legitimacy on the new one. Winning a war and being recognized as king are not the same thing. Jimmu won the war, but to become king, he needed something only the previous ruling line could provide. That reading cannot be proven, but it gains force when you consider what came after. The Mononobe clan went on to hold significant power in both ritual and military affairs for centuries, and the shrines that preserve forms of the Chinkon rite, comparable to the imperial ceremony Isonokami Jingu, Mononobe Jinja, Yahiko Jinja, are precisely those connected to the Nigihayahi tradition. That is not the trace of a dynasty that simply surrendered. It is the trace of something that was absorbed, not erased. This brings a deeper question into focus. Was Jimmu really the first? The question requires care. In the official imperial lineage maintained by the Imperial Household Agency, Jimmu is the first emperor. That institutional framework does not waver. But the question I want to ask is different. What does first actually mean? In history, instinct, or in memory? The first to rule Yamato, the first to hold heavenly authority there, or simply the point from which later compilers chose to begin the story? The chronicles themselves acknowledge the problem. Before Jimmu arrived, Nigihayahi was already in Yamato. If the genealogical and ritual traditions preserved in the Sendai Kuji Hongi contain something genuinely old, then what they preserve is the memory of a separate, heavenly descended ruling line that predated Jimmu's arrival. And the critical point is this: that line was never fully erased. The Shinsen Shojiroku, the 815 register of aristocratic clans, lists well over 100 clans claiming descent from Nigihayahi. By some counts, roughly a quarter of its divine descent lineages. That is not the footprint of a defeated local chieftain. It is the footprint of something the compilers of the chronicles could not simply remove. So they did the next best thing, they reframed it. A dangerous prior ruling line was recast as a loyal house that recognized Jimmu's legitimacy. The threat was absorbed into the victor's story. But beneath that story, the question remains: who was first in Yamato? Who gave the new king the ritual foundation he needed to reign? The chronicles answer: Jimmu. But the chronicles themselves preserve the traces of another answer. We have followed those traces through 6 sections now. Let me be careful about what can and cannot be said. This is a hypothesis. The evidence is limited, but the pattern is consistent. There is no direct evidence that Nigihayahi was a historical figure. The Sendai Kuji Hongi cannot be read as straightforward historical record. Many scholars would not accept the interpretation I have offered here, but the structure speaks. The compilers of Japan's foundational chronicles were forced to place a prior figure at the threshold of their own story. A figure whose presence threatened the narrative they were trying to secure. They included him because they could not remove him. The memory was too strong. The Mononobe clan was eventually destroyed in 587 AD in one of the most consequential political conflicts of early Japan. But destruction is not erasure. Memory disappears from texts, but it survives in ritual, in shrines, in genealogies, in the distortions left behind in the victor's story, in those places where the official account no longer fits cleanly together. If Nigihayahi stands at the center of that kind of memory, then Japan's founding myth is not simply the story of one lineage's triumph. It is the story of how a prior order was absorbed, ritually legitimized, and finally rewritten into a single continuous line of descent. The conquerors write history, but the memory of the conquered does not always die with them. Next time, the Great Disorder in Wa. The first major conflict in Japanese history described in Chinese sources. What happened in the space between the end of Nigihayahi's world and the rise of the order that replaced it?